Its importance can hardly be overestimated, for it had an enormous influence on medieval alchemy. Even the most modern alchemists, if one can use such an expression when speaking about 200 years ago, were under its fascination, and we find it quoted, in part or as a whole, in many alchemical treatises. Its origin is unknown, and we do not know if it was originally Greek, although there are certain indications pointing to this conclusion. If we were to deal thoroughly with such a text, we should have to approach the matter very differently, quite apart from the fact that it is really impossible to examine such a text in all its roots. Many things enter into these examinations, some are unknown, and some very difficult to explain. Here, Hermes affirms that the inscription on the tabula is true. Why? Are these teachings so extraordinary that one might conclude to have been deceived by them? Why doubt? This becomes clear in the following verses, which summarize the basic tenets of the tabula, which are indeed formidable. The second paragraph runs, "That which is below corresponds to that which is above." This sentence is quoted very often. We can see without difficulty that it refers to the relation between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Man was understood already in antiquity as a small mirror image of the whole of the world. As nature receives its quality from heaven, so does man. This is an idea which came originally from astrology, which assumed that man was really formed by the stars. The soul descended, according to this conception, from the highest heaven through the 7 spheres of the planets. Each planet imprinted its quality upon him, and his individual character depended on the amount and the way in which he was caught by each planet. This is, so to speak, the manuscript with which each of us comes to earth. It is the goal of the various mysteries to free man from this compulsion. The text tells us that the similarity between the above and below exists to accomplish the miracles of the one entity. This is very mysterious. What are we to understand by this one thing? It becomes clearer later, but the thought here evidently is that the miracle of the one thing first comes into existence through the syntheses of above and below. The third paragraph begins, "All things come from the one entity through the mediation of its one mind." The one is evidently the origin. Now the origin of all things is like the deity, the creator, the resuna. The one thing in alchemy is actually the deity. We know that positively. So we may assume that the basic material is the deity. To return to our Latin version of the Tabula Smaragdina and the sentence, "So do all created things originate from this one entity through transformation," one could think that this meant through mediation about the One, and that everything originated through this mediation, as the Spirit of God moving upon the face of the waters in the beginning. But it could also mean that the One mediated actively, that one person mediated the world into existence. But that the One should mediate, and that the world should be produced by the Spirit in its creative role, is a conception which goes directly back to the philosophy about the nous in antiquity. Then we come to the curious statement that all things came from this one thing through transformation. The Latin is adaptatio, though it is sometimes read as adoptio. This rendering is not generally accepted, however, though adaptatio is a very curious idea. Yet it corresponds to one of the oldest primitive conceptions of mankind about the way the world came into existence. There are Central Australian myths of the primordial ancestors who created things by transforming themselves into them. They adapted themselves, as it were, to things, although the things were not yet in existence. In the case of the first parents of the bow and arrow, for instance, the man transformed himself into a wooden part of the bow, the woman clung around his neck as the bowstring, and the fluffy ends of the string were her hair. This primordial ancestral pair transformed themselves into this weapon, and at any time they might retransform to their original shapes. That is true adaptatio. Now we come to the fourth paragraph. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. This again is very peculiar. Sun and moon are usually regarded as emanations or adaptations of the deity, and not as if they were its parents. But here it seems to be a matter of another form of deity, a god who is yet to be born, who should proceed from the One, that goes, so to speak, through all things and is born again from them. So we see here quite clearly that the one thing which is meant is a mysterious thing, whose parents are the sun and moon, and which originates in a sense of union of those two. The wind has carried it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. Here we have the four elements. The sun is fire, the moon water, the wind air, and the earth. So the original one has divided itself into the four elements through adaptation, and though the coming together of the four, it appears again as a united product. This is a thoroughly Egyptian idea, and we find a very interesting parallel on an inscription belonging to the 8th century BC, which is in London. This inscription speaks of a dividing up of the creative god Ptah. He was originally the god of craftsmen, of those who create things. Ptah created the world, and the inscription describes how he split himself into the elements, into the multiplicity of things. He did this by dividing himself into 8 basic forms, the so-called ogdoas. This octagon is the highest council, so to speak, and with the original Ptah makes 9, the Egyptian company of gods. But it is a matter of one whole god who has split himself up into 8 under-gods, and yet each of these gods is a Ptah, a whole god. We can recognize here a forerunner of the Christian Trinity. The Holy Trinity is also a God that is 3, without losing his unity, his tri-unitas. When the 4 in our text, or the 8 Ptahs, are united, the original one God appears again. He can, therefore, as it were, give forth this creation, mirror himself eightfold, and draw the whole back again into himself. The 5th paragraph is, "The origin of all the perfections of the world is here." We suddenly meet a masculine here. The Latin high can be the masculine nominative singular of this, or the adverb here. It is difficult to be sure which, but the father of completion is evidently the God that arises from the union of the 4, which have, so to speak, come together in order that the one should be conceived, that the one from which they originally sprang. The sun, the Father, has begotten it. The moon conceived it, the wind carried it, and the earth nourishes it. We must draw the conclusion here that this God has become his own Son. One could perhaps suspect Christian influence here, but as we have already seen in the Egyptian parallel, these ideas existed in antiquity long before the Christian era. We are therefore rather bound to draw the conclusion that the Christian conception originated in these much older ideas, or at least that it found the possibility of arising in such soil. The one thing which is born from the functional cooperation of the four elements is a real Son God. Perhaps it was on account of this understanding of this text that a later alchemist, Henricus Kunrath, a German doctor and philosopher of the 16th century, said that the purpose of alchemy was to produce the filius macrocosmi. Certainly, the one produced in the Tabula Smaragdina is a real filius macrocosm. Kunrath said that Christ was the filius macrocosmi because he was only for the world of man, whereas the filius macrocosmi of alchemy was for the whole world. The idea lies concealed here that Christianity is only concealed with the problem of the salvation of man, whereas alchemy is concerned with that of the whole of nature. The next sentence of the Tabula Smaragdina bears this out. Its strength is entire when it is converted to earth. This, turning itself towards the earth, is strictly opposed to the Christian conception. According to the latter, strength would be perfected through the Spirit, for the Spirit, and in the Spirit. But here it is expressly the physis, the strength of this filius, becomes perfect when it turns towards earth. It is clear that this Son does not, like the Redeemer figures in Christianity and Gnosticism, turn towards the realm of heaven and the Spirit. These Redeemers come from heaven, go down to earth, and return again to heaven. But this Son is born from the physis, from nature, and when it turns to the earth, then it has reached perfection. This is not at all a Christian idea. In the 7th paragraph, we find a prescription for the art. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. The addition "gently with great ingenuity" points out that it is a matter of a tremendous creative effort of the mind. The texts often use the word ingenium, where it is a case of a particular creative effort in the curious transformation which alchemy strives to produce. The injunction here refers to a typical alchemistic procedure, the separatio. One could also call this the analysis, during which the mixed-up elements of which every living being, man, animal, plant, and mineral consists, are separated. In the next sentence it is said, "It rises from the earth to heaven and descends again to the earth, thereby receiving the force of both things, superior and inferior." Here again we find the curious process of development, which is opposed to the other conceptions, where the Redeemers almost invariably come down from heaven and, when they have accomplished their work on earth, ascend there again. But here the movement goes from nature up into the spiritual realm of heaven and descends again onto the earth, gathering the strength of both into itself. We find a similar idea also in the Gnostic systems, where the Redeemer figures rob the archons, the rulers of the 7 spheres of heaven, of their powers. They are depotentiated by the fact that the Redeemer goes through the spheres of heaven without being affected by them. If, for instance, the Redeemer can deceive the archons so they do not notice that the highest Son of God is passing through their realm, he can reach the earth without being molested by them. When he has accomplished his work on earth, he goes back in full glory and depotentiates the archons, who are the rulers of human destiny. In our text, the movement is reversed. The 8th paragraph continues, "In this way you shall obtain the glory of the whole world, and thereby all obscurity shall fly away from you. Here it is apparently a matter of enlightenment. All darkness is removed from the one who accomplishes the art. This is a promise which can be compared to the promises always made by redeemers. But their promises are different, in that they promise that man shall be freed from the corruption of the body and reach the kingdom of the pure spirit. The 9th paragraph is, "This is a force strong with all forces, for it overcomes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing." This is a kind of play on words, a heaping up of the epithets of strength, meaning that the one which shall be produced has the most extraordinary power. One must always keep in mind in such cases that the real thing may be weak and that therefore its strength is overemphasized. The 10th paragraph is, "In this way the world was created." So this process corresponds exactly to the creation of the world. The deity divided itself in the beginning into the 4 or 8, and through the reversal of this process, the filius macrocosmi came into being. The world is created again, but a different world, the world of the sun. When we speak of the world, we really only speak of an impression of the world. The world is an image to us, even when we have a scientific conception of it and assert, "This is so and so." It is still only an image. We begin to realize that the more firmly we believe something, the more likely it is to change in a few decades. Man at that time was bound to say the world is such and such. No one could say, "I think such and such about the world." Our parents and their parents knew that the world was governed by a benevolent Father, and they were absolutely sure of eternal salvation if they behaved at all decently. All this has changed in our lifetime. The 11th paragraph is, "From this will come many admirable applications, the means of which is in this." The admirable applications are the creation of nature, which come forth from the one thing through its spiritual activity. The manner of these applications is represented here and is undoubtedly a psychical process. Then its direction is reversed, the elements are reunited, and a new world comes into being. The end of the text is, "Therefore I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world. What I have said of the operation of the sun is finished." The sun is another word in alchemistic language for gold, so presumably Hermes has been describing the art of gold making or alchemy. The two terms are synonymous. But the sun could be understood differently as the light of day, a symbol of consciousness. The sun also represents the nous in man, the spirit in man, which originates in the divine spirit, that is, in the deity, thought of as a light which illuminates everything. And, through adaptation, the consciousness of each individual arises from the primeval consciousness. Our consciousness is thus understood as a splitting up of the archetypal consciousness. This all-embracing light, or consciousness, is attributed to the deity. So the operatio solis, the transformation of the gold, could also mean the transformation of that light which we have received through adaptation from the deity, in other words, the transformation of our consciousness.